Hi, this is Tara. Welcome to SkyGazing and welcome to The Seekers. The Seekers is a new podcast that looks at the practice and the path. And how do we look at the practice and the path? Through the practitioner. For centuries, India has attracted seekers, spiritual wanderers, skeptics, believers, the curious, the mad, the mystics, and the devoted. And occasionally we cross each other's paths. In that crossing often comes a moment of recognition of ourselves, our own journeys, our own seeking, in that of others. And thus we realize that we may be traveling alone, but we're in this alone together. This is the basis of the Sangha. So, in this podcast, we're looking at the ways in which people pursue a spiritual practice, what it means to practice, what it is we're seeking, what is this process of seeking, how far have we come, just not in terms of just progress, but in terms of the journey, what our expectations were when we began, how have they changed, what influenced us, what helped us, what has protected us, what haunts us, what have we given up, what are we gaining, and where we find home in the shalas, in the ashrams, in the monasteries and dhams of India, on the riverbanks. What solace is there in these forests or in these caves in which the yogis dwell? As we traverse these uncertain grounds, as we form these communities, we see a light in someone. We recognize a doubt that we have harbored and find an answer that someone else has left us. In these episodes, we will recognize, acknowledge, and learn from each other's journeys. So, my first guest here today is Deepika Ahlawat, a fellow seeker, is how she would like me to introduce her. And she's right, because all of us, when we come on this path, we're stripped down bare naked to just the act of seeking. It doesn't matter who we are, what our families are, what designations we have, where we live, our wealth, our status, because on this path, we're all wanderers, we're all starting with that beginner's mind, with just all that defines us is our seeking and our commitment to it and our understanding of it and how that allows us to grow. So everybody you will meet on this podcast, you may think you know them from other places, but maybe you don't, until you've sat down with the seeker and just met them in their seeking. You won't realize that we are each our seeking. So I hope you enjoy this podcast, and I hope we all learn something from it. Thank you so much for listening. Now let's listen to Deepika. Start there, Deepika. Firstly, thank you so much for being my first guest on this new podcast, and talk to me a little bit about what it means to be a seeker to you.
Thank you for having me. It's an honor. What it means to be a seeker. I don't think it's possible to not be a seeker. So I think that everybody's looking for a meaning of life. If you've lived at all, if you're a conscious being. And if you still, for one moment, and stop and see, okay, why am I here? What am I doing? You are a seeker. And I think that it's a fundamental way of being of a person. It would be very odd to not be one.
So what you're saying is that essentially at our core, we're all seeking something.
I would find it extremely odd not to. Like that would be an anomalous occurrence for me, don't you think?
I would agree, but also this is reminding me of a speech given by Jiddu Krishnamurti in, I think it was in Switzerland. Okay, it's called "What Are We Seeking?" And over there, he poses this question right to the audience, and he says, start with the question, "What is it we are seeking?" And he says, don't dismiss it, don't think it's light, because it also kind of, I think, connects to the Buddhist concept of the motivation, setting the intention, right? This is common to all Indic philosophies, that it's not really about what you find on the journey, the tangibleness of it, but the intention with which we are beginning, the motivation we're setting as we're starting out. And for a lot of people, we seek material things. We seek security, we seek so called stability, we seek companionship. We seek wealth. Is spiritual seeking then distinct or separate from all of that?
I don't think so, because I think seeking at the heart of it is the seeking of the meaning of life. When that's intrinsic to living, to consciousness itself. So all of these things are just manifestations of finding that meaning, like all of the things that you mentioned: security, companionship, love, etc., etc., etc. All of these become the most important thing that people seek at a particular phase in their life. Now, if you um, and all of these will fall by the wayside at some point, just not being the entirety of life, or not being the entire meaning of life. And therefore, I choose not to separate them from the pursuit of this so-called spirituality. I don't think life is built in this mode of spiritual and unspiritual. Life is seeking, and
Right.
that's it. There is no other way of being.
Do you think that somewhere, for instance, you said that there is this, um, all of this is part of finding, right? Do we find? Is there an end to the seeking?
I think that's entirely personal, isn't it? When you've completely resolved that, like you've solved that game quest, you've solved that level, you've solved that life, I think you become enlightened. In our philosophy, that's called moksha. In yours is probably called nirvana. But it's um, and only that person and that consciousness knows that answer, because it cannot be taught. It has to be realized. So presumably there is an end, but not to my seeking yet.
Would you want to explain or elaborate a little bit on the nature of your seeking?
That's an interesting question, because I keep on going back to thing which appears to be a very dismissive answer, but actually it is the crux of my existence itself. Philosophy is, people tend to separate philosophy from life, but philosophy is life. So it's life cannot be separated from the seeking of the meaning of it for a conscious being. So seeking is impossible to escape. It is the mode that we are born with. And if you have to turn off that mode, you have to do something incredibly special, uh, which is to not be human.
But are you answering that question from the point of view of a seeker? And therefore, are you assuming that there is nothing but seeking? That all life is seeking? For instance, haven't we met people who seem so blissfully content at a very, very material level that they're not seeking, they're not wandering?
Maybe they're found.
Ah,
Who
but
am I
that's
to
the
judge what
question.
they
But that's the question, right? Does anybody ever?
Yeah, but that is for them to decide. I haven't. Maybe they have found. That is a question for them to answer, not for me to judge, or anyone else to judge for someone else. Have they found or not? But we are at our root seekers. I mean, that is our default mode of starting life, seeking. Because, human beings start with curiosity. What are we here for? And as soon as you ask that question, you become a seeker.
In fact, Ramana Maharshi says this. I think I have this somewhere. Wait, let me just pull this up. So he says, by the inquiry, who am I? The thought, who am I, will destroy all other thoughts. And like the stick used for stirring the burning pyre, it will itself in the end get destroyed. Then there will arise self-realization. And then after he says this, there's a question about practice. And the question is, what is the means for constantly holding on to the thought, who am I? To which Bhagwan replies, when other thoughts arise, one should not pursue them, but should inquire, to whom do they arise? It does not matter how many thoughts arise, as each thought arises, one should inquire with diligence, to whom has this thought arisen? The answer would be to me. Thereupon, if one inquires, who am I? The mind will go back to its source, and the thought that arose will become quiet. with repeated practice in this manner, the mind will develop the skill to stay in its source. I just noted this down the other day when I was doing some research. So, what he's basically pointing to is the cyclic nature of the who am I question, that where we begin is where we end.
Yeah, but I have a slightly different perspective to that because you tend to think of other thoughts as being separate from this. Like there is somehow a spiritual thought that is correct and an unspiritual thought which is incorrect. And I think that's not true at all. I think all thoughts are part of the seeking, all of them, all of our entire being of our consciousness. And consciousness isn't some kind of, noble idea removed from our life. Consciousness is life. Every thought that has ever occurred to you, ever. What am I going to eat next? Am I sleepy? Am I tired? Do I need to drink water, etc., etc. Every single thought is a question of seeking what am I doing? Why am I here? Who is this person? What is this? There is nothing, no thought of ours is separate from us. So it is all us. And there's no noble thought and not noble thought. It's all a part of us.
But then the question arises, then is there a point to all the wandering and seeking we're doing? Why are
Presumably
we?
that.
Because there is a journey away from the self to come back to the self.
I'm not sure. If you were perfectly content with who you are, you arrived.
But see, that's the thing. Again, I'm going to point to the fact that you're speaking from the point of arriving, and most of us are not there yet.
Exactly. And that is seeking. So as you are not content, you have not arrived. Once you become content, that is the end of the journey.
How do we become content in this world where we're sort of pulled in? And I know you said that everything is part of that seeking, right? All the journeys that we're making, but look at it from the point of view of just the mass of us, okay, all of us who are entering into systems of education, systems of work, systems of relationships in those institutions. How are they contributing to this process of seeking?
How are they not? I again point to you that these are not contradictory pursuits. That whenever social institutions are created, they are created at their root for some kind of a peaceful coexistence. I'm not saying that all motivation for social institutions are benign. They may be to serve certain individuals who believe that their seeking involves power over others, or their seeking involves X ambition or Y ambition, etc. That is also their seeking. Criminal seeking is also seeking. Ambition is seeking, villainous seeking is also seeking. But it's social institutions are formed to effectively manage human life. So it is a form of institutionalized seeking, that has been created. Okay, humans work like this. How can we make massive humans work more efficiently? So that is at their root. At their root, there is some sort of seeking. Okay, this is the end of human life, or this is the aim of human life, or this is the aim of our human society. So if you ask people, oh, what is the purpose of your civilization? Most people will point out, oh, look at the literature we've created, look at the music we've created, look at the buildings we've created. It's basically a whole bunch of stuff, and maybe that is the end of human life. Who knows? But it's if you ask them what is the point of your civilization, very few people are actually able to point out to this is the point of my civilization. They will instead point out to stuff that people have created in that civilization. So do civilizations and cultures end up arriving at the point that they are seeking? Maybe not. But that points to the fact that they are institutionalized nature of seeking. So I don't think it is a contradictory pursuit to individual seeking. It's just a more coalesced version of it.
So, is there a collective seeking then? Are we seeking because we're part of a particular culture or a civilization or a nation, state in today's terms? Is our seeking necessarily based on some sort of common ground, or is seeking just a very very individual pursuit?
Hmm. That probably comes from the idea of how much of us and how much of our thinking is arisen from the individual. So if you were to raise, say, I was raised on an island with no humans, so what thoughts would arise in my mind? And that experiment is a very different experiment because the people who are brought up like that do not have the means of communication of these sort of ideas anymore with people who've been brought up in human societies. So we don't really know, and I don't think enough experiments have been done. But so a lot of what we think is the cumulative knowledge of mankind, and what kind of knowledge we seek and what kind of um, ideas come to us as being natural and acceptable is a part of your cultural sort of environment. And for example, as a Hindu, the idea of being completely tolerant to other religious beliefs is very natural to me. So it does not occur to me to say to you, if you don't believe in my God, you will go to hell. But to many faiths, that is a perfectly natural belief that if you don't believe in my faith, you will go to hell. And they've never questioned their belief. So the naturalness of our beliefs is a product of our culture.
Mm.
So I think that I'm unable to determine how much of my ideas would be mine and how much of ideas come from the cumulative sort of, you know, uh, the congealment of ideas that comes from living in a particular cultural environment. So the answer would be, I don't know.
Isn't that somewhere the point of seeking is to sort of, at least, okay, in the kind of seeking that say I'm doing, or that you might, I presume, be engaged in, is this sort of peeling back the layers of the mind? So whether it's yoga, whether it's Buddhism, whether it's Hinduism, whichever school of thought, especially in on the Indian sort of subcontinent that originates from here, we're sort of doing a couple of things. One is trying to investigate the nature of reality. The second is to understand our own minds. And the third is to either understand or dismantle this idea of the self, right? And so one would think that the more one, so whether you're doing yoga or meditation or some sadhana or, worshipping a deity, at the end of it are these sort of, key goals, even if the individual parts are separate. So one would assume that in that process itself would separate you from the collective and ask you to. We have this way of establishing the individual and the individual's relation to, say, the absolute, which then becomes universalized. So, isn't questioning the collective also part of that process?
I'm not sure because I interpret this separation of the self from uh, the world. I mean, I have actually in Hinduism never encountered this concept of. There is a concept of the world, the let's call it the secular world in English, but it's not the fact that the people and other consciousnesses that inhabit it are somehow not on your path, or
Hmm.
you have to separate yourself from them. We
Hmm.
don't have that concept. Everybody is on that path. Everybody is on a perfectly valid path. You don't have to separate from them to be on a spiritual path at all. So maybe we don't have that idea. Not even in the idea of seeking, say, the ascetic life, of seeking a life of a non-worldly person. do we have that concept of somehow that people who are on that worldly path are not on the path of seeking?
Let me give you an example. Okay, for instance, if you look at Adi Shankaracharya or whether you look at Siddhartha, right? A whole part of their seeking was to say, do I agree with the collective idea of what it means to be established in a practice? And then what is my practice and what is the path that I would follow? And that has never been um, disallowed, even if there were sort of attempts to pull them back and say, what are you doing? There is an inherent freedom in all of this culture to question, to seek, to not conform, to not necessarily fit in with the collective idea, prevalent collective idea of this is how it is done.
Probably because like our dharma is so old that there is no prevalent collective idea. There have been so many divergences, and so many people have had, like, if you could, like, one particular work has thousands of commentaries and 10,000 glosses, so we don't have a book, we have an entire library. So don't really have this, we don't have an academy to rebel against,
Hmm.
because our rebellions and it is so ancient that there have been so many diversions in that path that it has become this vast tent, and you can set up wherever you want under that tent. Nobody
Hmm.
will question you at all.
Is there
So
sometimes?
maybe
Hmm.
we don't have that idea of protest. We don't have that idea of being a diversionary person, because um, it's not a new thing for us. Like, we don't have some kind of a revolution in ideas, because there is no sort of primary idea.
Got it. So what you're basically saying is all these figures who have sort of stood out at various points in history are in fact a stream of seekers themselves who found different paths and meaning and purpose, and without that necessarily in being indicative of a protest or a rebellion, because nothing about that was dissonant.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I'm going to go. I'm going to wear my hat of one of my occupations, a historian. This is a problem of historical narrative,
Hmm.
and that historical narrative is the way we tell history, which is based on Western ideas of telling history, which is to say
Hmm.
that one guy comes along, is a revolutionary, and is protesting against the church, essentially. So they're trying to construct the church figure in every point in history, which is not theirs. So they do
Okay.
the same thing in history. Of course, there are political points of conflict where, Shankaracharya existed in a place where there was conflict between people who had power, who had Hindu ideas, and people who had power, who had Buddhist ideas, but not necessarily the ideas being in conflict themselves, or there being a mainstream primary Hinduism which he was propagating or protesting against. That is not the case. Even today, if you were to ask me, oh, this particular panth stands out because they're going against the mainstream idea of Hinduism, I mean, an idiotic Western commentator would say, and they would probably make a fortune out of it, saying, oh, yeah, this is the primary idea of Hinduism. And a Hindu would ask, what is the primary idea of Hinduism?
Yeah.
Which is the correct question to ask.
Yeah. So we don't have a fixed center. So and therefore
Exactly.
we're
And there
not
has
really
never
operating.
been. Hmm.
So we're not
Not even with
operating.
the Buddha.
Yeah. So we're not operating neither linearly because, and we can have a separate podcast on the construct of time. Within Hinduism and Buddhism both. But nor do we have that notion then of a boundary, because if you don't have a center, you don't have an end,
Yeah.
right? A diameter or a radius, and therefore nothing is disallowed in the scope of exploration.
Exactly. And at least within the philosophical realm. Now, whether there is a perfect translation from the realm of ideas in the realm of practice, that depends on the minds of the people who are in power at the time. So, does it mean that everybody is completely tolerant? For the most part, a lot of them, yes, because of course, remember when the Siddhartha is seeking followers, he does not have power at all. He's a
Yeah.
displaced prince. So if somebody really wanted to say, okay, actually, I don't want your ideas running around, could have been beheaded in 2 minutes. But the
Yeah, and
fact that
and he taught a lot at Varanasi as well, which was the center of epicenter of Hinduism at that point.
exactly.
Uh,
So the idea that these are somehow protesting movements, and I see that a lot in the history of Buddhism, actually, and I find them utterly ridiculous, frankly, because nobody is actually going back to the primary sources and say, yes, there's always been debate in that's the whole point of the Hindu and Indian ethos. People will constantly debate the nature of reality and the nature of God and the nature of right and the nature of wrong. But there is no central sort of tenet against which you're rebelling, you
Correct.
know. So I
Absolutely.
see all of these completely idiotic ideas that some historians have been running around with, and that can constantly get repeated in sort of um, as cited sources in books that are being churned out even this very year, for example. And I find that ridiculous. Like, please go back to the primary sources and look at the history again. This is a victimization. I mean, this kind of history telling is a victim of, a colonial form of history telling, which isn't just about, this is a period of colonization. It's a colonization of the way we tell our own histories, which is completely sort of an imprint of European history, because European religious history is based on this idea of the Lutheran, etc., etc., protesting against a central tenet of a
Hmm.
religion. And they constantly try to copy that kind of the themes of that and, sort of imprint upon Indic religious histories.
Yeah. I get your point. But also that for us, we've had institutions that and that continue to um, symbolize or typify this kind of debate, the multiple schools of Hindu thought, philosophical thought, the multiple schools of Buddhist thought also, even within the Mahayana and the Theravada traditions or Shravakayana. And even within each, there are like multiple schools of thought, again, in those. Probably best symbolized by, say, something like Nalanda University. Because, I've been teaching Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, or studying Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. And the more you read, especially bhashas by Ved Vyasa, Maharshi Ved Vyasa, and then you're realizing they're citing Nagarjuna, who was one of the greatest Mahayana scholars. And there's this flow of thought, and many times in Maharshi Vedvyasa's bhashyas, he's responding to things in Buddhist thought, he's responding to things in Charvaka thought. And this is essentially the Yoga Sutras or Sankhya philosophy. So there is this need for nuance, where and clearly there has been this conversation, this ongoing conversation between people who think differently, even about just the fundamentals of life, like what is mind. We don't even need to get into what is religion and what is society based on that religion supposed to be like. What is my mind and what is my body are like fundamental questions of philosophical thought. But then my question to you is, a lot of these conversations happen um, at a level of seekers who are highly elevated in thought, in thinking, and in expertise. They're either enlightened and are speaking in this way to guide everybody who isn't, through an example of their debate and conversation, or they're almost there. So, but then my question is this a confusing milieu for those of us who are still sort of on the street of these multiple options, ways of thinking? Is it, can you like end up going from place to place and not really understanding because we're not getting deep into where, for example, one system?
It's like going into a supermarket and looking at all the options for. Uh, I remember when I first went to America as a very young, and I because all their food tasted extremely weird of plastic, but there was so much of it. Like there was just an incredible amount of choice in cereal, breakfast cereal, like thousands of them. And I found it to be utterly bewildering and very confusing. And then when you actually ate it, it was terrible. So I was thinking, and I think that it might be very confusing and discombobulating to actually look at the amount of options available in terms of, which is why Hinduism is not a religion that is easy,
Hmm.
because you have to do your own seeking, so you have to find your
Exactly.
own path. Whereas many other faiths are very simple: follow these commandments, follow this one book, you're done. Do this, do that, you're done. So to many other people, I mean, let's not talk about the freedom of religious choice, the fact that
Hmm.
most people are born into a religious tradition and can never leave it. And in
Hmm.
fact, some people, they might be killed if they leave that religious tradition. So here we have the option of choice, and it is confusing to have choice, but it is ultimately more rewarding because you get to open up every packet and check whether I like it or not, and then move on. So I think it's that is the process of the journey of actually being able to see, does this work with this particular mind of mine that I have in this life. um, and this is a very familiar concept both in Hinduism and Buddhism, I think. And I'm going to use the word Hinduism because it's commonly used. It's
Hmm.
not the correct word. But in our tradition, we have loads and loads of these, which you have in Buddhism also. They exist, which is um, to a clever man, etc. You know, that kind of, to a
Hmm.
middle intelligent man, to a fool, etc., etc. These three classifications of intelligence,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
people for, and they're different sorts, and they're it's like very, it's Nietzsche kind of aphorisms that are highly meaningful, etc., etc. Um, but they tend to at least make three classifications of the nature of your mind and the
Hmm.
nature of your intelligence. And the same thing will occur, the same sort of concept will appear differently to people of different intelligences. And when I was younger, I used to think it actually refers to three different people.
Hmm.
And when I became older, I realized it refers to me in different stages of seeking of my mind. So, the same thing is the fact, it's not that the words are changing, it's the fact that your mind is changing. And that kind of elevation of you changing as a person, and you changing, you approach text differently, you approach philosophies differently. And I think, therefore, you will never know the ultimate sort of nature of your destination, because you will never be able to go back to the mind that you had before. And I think that's and that's part of the journey, that's part of the seeking that you have, that you cannot fully imagine this journey at all, and nor can you fully recall it because you don't have the same mind as you had when you started.
That is so fantastically said. Because, and it's so true because, um, as you were speaking, I was just recalling that Sutra number 4 is an entire contradiction of Sutra number 47, because in Sutra number 4, Patanjali says you must turn to scripture and text and seek your gurus. And in Sutra 47, he says you must discard all of that. And that is the exact thing, because what happens is people tend to see these, and even in the Buddha's teachings, even in his first 3 sermons, There are inherent contradictions. And the third sermon comes up because he has a disciple who stands up and says, "Hello, you're contradicting yourself in your first sermon and your second sermon." So, and then he gives the third sermon, which is a complete sort of other viewpoint. And people think that these are contradictions in teachings, but they're actually not, because a lot of these masters, gurus, teachers, enlightened ones are, because they're so ahead and because their perspective is so overarching, they are seeing our learning curve before we've got on it.
Hmm.
So they're leaving a sort of milestone or a detour in the roadmap for a point when we will reach them, and we haven't yet. you know and I find that fascinating. But there is this view of which is probably why it's so confusing to so many people who are on this path. And to be sure, our philosophies, and I'm talking about all Indian philosophies, draw people from all over the world who probably are not born into our culture, who are probably not born into these contradictory ways of thinking and debating, and which overall may be contradictory to everything that they have grown up with. So, for instance, you'll find a lot of guru shopping or philosophy shopping on this spiritual. If you drew a spiritual map of India, you'll find people walking that trail, and sometimes they're confused. Sometimes they are sidetracked by the baubles of the spiritual world. And sometimes they're just bewildered. And are these contradictions, as you said, it's not easy. It's not easy. But it's easier for those of us who understand that that is integral to the code,
Hmm.
you know?
Yes, I have a great deal of respect for people who leave simple traditions of, do this, do that, um, and go out into uncharted waters of people of, hey, you're going to be allowed to question everything, but we're not sure you're going to find an answer. That is a difficult plunge to take, and those who take it, are brave people, um, because they've essentially been swimming in a shallow pool and they suddenly go into an open ocean. And those of us who are born into an ocean, we sort of maybe don't question the fact that, hey, we're being beaten about by the current and we're probably not going to get that this thing of floating around without any purpose or destination is the nature of human existence, is too terrifying an idea to confront uh, early on in life. But I think by the end, by sort of you've lived a few years, you sort of, oh my God, this sort of being buffeted around, that is life. That is life. That is going to be my existence. I think, and that's maybe you're arriving at one checkpoint, to a destination. The realization that seeking is life.
So when I'm thinking of for instance SN Goenka, who says, you can dig 10 wells 1 foot deep, or you can dig one well 10 feet deep, and either say, okay, I didn't find this water, I don't like this water, or this is the water. you know and at some point you have to is it that at some point you have to commit to one path?
I'm not sure, because I think the commitment is not the committing to that path, but the path is the act of committing, because that you've decided to commit is your path. That's the fact that you think that no further exploration is required, or I need to now find a conviction and stick with it. Maybe you've arrived at that particular path, that you seek conviction as your answer. Uh,
Hmm.
so I, yeah, to me, that is not my journey at this point, because it discounts too much of the existence of the rest of the world. But as I say, it's an entirely individual assessment. If somebody believes, okay, now I think this is my destination, they've arrived. Who is someone else to question them?
But I find this notion of us having arrived, okay, used too easily in the world today. And look, I do understand, like, for instance, it is said that in the Kali Yuga, you'll have thousands of Buddhas and thousands of enlightened people, whereas in the, say, Treta Yuga, it would be far fewer, simply because the standard is much higher. The criterion is much higher because there's so many good people around. And then those who graduate top of the class are, a special bunch. And in the Kali Yuga, technically, it's supposed to be that goodness is so rare that anybody who has a spark of it, a guru will sort of push you through the gates at the minimal criteria. So, my point is that we see this commercialization of dharma today in the world.
Mm.
The very easy, just from the basic, take this class and you've mastered Kundalini Yoga, which is like, good God, no, you haven't, to sometimes I'll be browsing YouTube and I'll see people say that they'll read a tarot card and they'll tell you your enlightenment is coming, you know and so is conviction that I am on the path and I am on the right path, is my feeble, worldly, tangible mind with all its um, viparyaya, that is the misperception and vikalpa, sort of sufficient witness to my progress on my path?
I think it's a question. If it's my progress on the path, then we have the concept of the Mritrishna, which is the mirage. The fact that you think you arrived at the oasis and it's not there. So that's an individual's point about the fact that, hey, this appears to be what I'm seeking, but it's actually not. It's part of your journey. The fact that you cannot see its end. But again, I will sort of stick to the idea that somebody else's journey is for them to take and not for us to judge whether it's commercialized or not, etc., etc. I mean, within our institutional nature of society, there are criminal actions that, yes, a guru is doing XYZ, exploiting things in the name of, you say, that's
Yeah.
a separate path. That's a criminal act is a criminal act. But within the bounds of non-criminal actions, whatever you can do in terms of seeking, etc. Um, uh, who am I to judge? We don't have a central authority, so I think we completely devolve the authority of what is your path to you. And I think that's unsettling for many people because we don't have a central authority, and we don't have a central authority giving out, tags, hey, you're a proper guru, to people either.
Which is an interesting point, because that brings us to the concept of the uncertain ground, you know which is, if you're on this, if and I say if, but you've said that everybody is on this path of seeking, there is a fundamental uncertainty that we are all constantly living with, because it's kind of said that when you arrive at certainty is dead, because there's so much evolution, and there's so many layers, and there's so much alteration and perception, there's so much to learn, there's so much expansion of these non-boundaries, that it's kind of like the more you learn, the less you know, right? So
Hmm.
speak to me a little bit about this is it a very Indic concept, this uncertainty?
None of you study physics, obviously, but there is a sort of coming together of these ideas of the fact that life and the idea of having a consciousness inhabit this universe is to accept uncertainty and unknowing. The fact that, hey, there's a whole bunch of stuff to know, and I don't know it. I'm not going to know it. And I don't even know what I don't know. So these ideas are very unsettling for people who are used to certainties and your fixed answers. But you take any particular human pursuit, any human subject, physics, mathematics, biology, etc., anything at all, a study of the natural universe, and you end up with the same principle of uncertainty that is at the root of existence. Our seeking in life is obviously going to be the same.
But isn't that how we kind of also, I'm just thinking that in this data society and the focus on science based and evidence based, and um, we get labeled, especially those of us who seek, and who are rejecting the tangible as the only source of pramana, of evidence.
Tangible, except tangible is not tangible
Yeah.
because how far do you go down to the realm of the tangible? I mean, to the paramanu, below paramanu. Hinduism has we have texts which go down below, like which would many people go, oh, this is a parallel to the quarks and whatever subatomic particles that we're thinking of today. So there is some text in Hinduism which has gone down to the smallest possible manifestation of a thing to the largest possible manifested thing. And the whole idea of being a mental exercise of the first scale. So when you start touching these things and say go down into it's made of atoms, it's made of subatomic particles, and within an atom there is space, and within all of that sort of thing. So what is this thing then? Is it solid? Is it something that I can touch? So there is no tangibleness in tangible things. It was my point in the sense that when you actually begin um, to reach the end of human knowledge on a particular subject, there is a convergence of the idea of religious ideas um, about the nature of things with the scientific understanding of the nature of things, and both converge upon uncertainty.
Okay, this is a supremely fascinating, exercise in understanding what it is we're doing when we seek. But for instance, there is this constant criticism that the spiritual seeker has the luxury of exiting the real world, the tangible world. It's a self-indulgent mental exercise, right? So is the spiritual seeker capable of practicality? Is he capable of being a productive central member of society, or do we just throw that all out and just do our seeking?
I don't think that. I mean, at least in Hindu, the dharmic existence, you have the entire notion of the grahast. So you have a duty towards being a householder, being someone who takes part in the secular world. So we don't have that separation, again, as I pointed out to you, because we don't come from a tradition which separates the seeking from the living. Living is seeking. So no, I think all of life is seeking. And that's why we know, if you want to look at the ashram, the varnashram phases, some which have been described as for human life, you have the fact that you're going to want to do certain things at certain points in your life, and then go and do other pursuits at other points in your life. That exists, but also you can do lots of these things simultaneously. They're not separate from each other. So I think that we don't really have that concept of separation um, at all. Maybe it is, that's what being Hindu is. We don't have that separation.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And that ties in with what you said about seeking is life. Seeking is life. In every moment, there is no point at which this is my spiritual world and this is my material world. And that integrated view is what sort of carries us forward through our material life as well. I'm unfortunately going to have to wrap this now, but I can't thank you enough for the valuable insights you've sort of brought to what it is we're doing and how we're proceeding in this process of self-investigation and investigation of the world and others. And thank you so much, Deepika, for being here and for sharing your wisdom with us. Thank you so much.
Wisdom, I won't say. Just my life. That's all. So it's my way of living. If it's helpful to others, good.